Kids, we are living in a time of transition. Not just seasonal transition, but a transition of cultural focus. Away from Halloween and into Christmas, and for our U.S. listeners, into Thanksgiving. And what happens a lot of time in the midst of this power struggle between those cultural moments, too often, Remembrance Day is lost. And I had an experience this week that reminded me the effect to which Remembrance Day is lost, and it annoys me, all right? So what this time of year gives me the opportunity to do is talk about the First World War, and I am always happy to do that. I'm going to do it on this episode. If that's not your bag, I'm also going to talk about some new music by, of all bands, the Beatles, as well as our old friend Mick. Not Jagger, Mars. So, it's a bit of a hodgepodge this week, but kids, 'tis the season. And we'll get to it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. 3 hours ago, he blundered up the trench. Sliding and poising, groping with his boots, sometimes he tripped and lurched against the walls with hands that pawed the sodden bags of chalk. He couldn't see the man who walked in front. Only he heard the drum and rattle of feet stepping along the trench boards, often splashing wretchedly where the sludge was ankle deep. Voices would grunt, "Keep to your right, make way," when squeezing past the men from the front line. White faces peered, puffing a point of red. Candles and braziers glinted through the chinks and curtain flaps of dugouts. Then the gloom swallowed his sense of sight. He stooped and swore because a sagging wire had caught his neck. A flare went up. The shining whiteness spread and flickered upward, showing nimble rats and mounds of glimmering sandbags bleached with rain. Then the slow, silver moment died in the dark. The wind came posting by with chilly gusts, and buffeting at corners, piping thin and dreary through the crannies. Rifle shots would split and crack and sing along the night, and shells came calmly through the drizzling air to burst with hollow bang below the hill. 3 hours ago, he stumbled up the trench. Now he will never walk that road again. He must be carried back, a jolting lump beyond all need of tenderness and care, a 9-stone corpse with nothing more to do. He was a young man with a meager wife and 2 pale children in a Midland town. He showed the photograph to all his mates, and they considered him a decent chap who did his work and hadn't much to say, and always laughed at other people's jokes because he hadn't any of his own. That night, when he was busy at his job of piling bags along the parapet, he thought how slow time went, stamping his feet and blowing on his fingers pinched with cold. He thought of getting back by 12:30, and a tot of rum to send him warm to sleep, in a drafty dugout frosty with fumes of coke and full of snoring, weary men. He pushed another bag along the top, craning his body outward, then a flare gave one white glimpse of no man's land and wire. And as he dropped his head, the instant split his startled life with lead. And all went out. Siegfried Sassoon. That was a poem published in 1919 by Siegfried Sassoon, who is one of your most remembered, most famous war poets of the British Army in the First World War. And I read it to you now because it's remembrance season, kids, and on the weekend, Just a couple days ago, I am walking through one of your big box stores in search of a big box that I could not find. And something's picking at the edges of my consciousness. Something irritating, and then I hear it. Clear as the day. Fa la 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 la. Why do they do it? Why do they do it? We're talking about November 4 here. 4th November, I'm out in the shops and I'm hearing the fa la 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 la. And I look around and it's just Christmas decorations everywhere. And you wonder to yourself, why do they do it? They know it drives us freaking crazy. And so the cynic in me, who is alive and well, takes a look around and says, well, there's got to be some sort of retail reason for this. They wouldn't do something that annoys so many of us so persistently if there wasn't some economic benefit to it. And it turns out there is, actually. I looked into it, and there is research to suggest that playing Christmas music in the stores surrounds shoppers with a sense of urgency, like, uh-oh, Christmas is coming, gotta buy those presents. And then they put themselves into a shopping frame of mind because there is this urgency around, I gotta get all my Christmas shopping done, right? And so the Christmas carols add that layer of urgency to your purchasing. And then it turns out, if you couple the Christmas songs, that nostalgia, with a particular scent, be it the scent of pine or the scent of cinnamon, maybe apple pie. If you can combine those things, the songs and the scents, then it has this effect on you of making you feel, basically, warms your cockles. Makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel nostalgic, gives you that warm cockle feeling, and that makes you, A, more inclined to spend time in the store, have a favorable impression of the store, and therefore increase the likelihood that you'll buy something. And so, yeah, they're pumping in the Christmas music as early as they possibly freaking can because you're more likely to spend your money. And isn't it easy to be cynical, kids? I think the problem that a lot of us have is that so much of everything is just about profit and being for sale. And you can call me a pinko commie if you like, but I am just tired of the cynicism of everything, you know? And you go to the States and everything is for sale, man. Healthcare is a for-profit industry. Education, obviously. And I think most of us are just tired of being sold to, having our information sold, everything being for sale. And this is, we're wearing away the veneer. We are rubbing away the pretense of capitalism and really beginning to understand underneath how much everything is all just about profit, man. And it's what drives a lot of us crazy. A lot of us want to have ideals and believe in a society that espouses ideals that are more elevated than that. But the reality is it just comes down to dollars and cents, man. And that's why there's so much crap music on the radio, because it's innocuous, right? And there's so much bad entertainment because, they take the safest route. And so it is in music. I've talked before about how back in the day, a band would get an opportunity and a record label might take a chance on something that's a little bit eclectic, a little bit different, give a band 3 or 4 records to build an audience, build a fan base, and it just doesn't exist anymore. Now it's like, give us a single, and if it doesn't hit, you're out. And it's got to fit these parameters, and you got to look like this, and you got to sound like this, and that's not new. I know that's been going on forever, but it's just becoming more and more and more exposed. The level to which everything is for sale, and that's why the Christmas music is happening. It is not because the corporation is feeling festive. It's to sell you stuff, man. And doesn't that just add another layer of cynicism to the whole freaking Christmas thing? Just annoys me, annoys everybody. The Christmas music is annoying, and I like Christmas. That's the thing. I mean, the feeling of warm cockles is genuine in this case, you know? And I don't even mind hearing it in the department store in an appropriate time frame. But it irks me, as it irks a lot of people, that the second the Halloween is over, you know, the first day, November 1st, All Saints Day, everybody's got the Christmas stuff up and ready to rock and roll. And, you know, over in the dusty corner is the poppy box. We're going to skip right past Remembrance Day. Doesn't matter. All I'm asking is that you wait out of some respect for history, some respect for the sacrifice that folks have made, that you wait until Remembrance Day is over before you start in with heavy-duty freaking Christmas, man. Lewis Black did a funny bit where he was talking about American Thanksgiving, which, as we know, is later than Canadian Thanksgiving. And he's like, why do we bother? Just call it what it is, Christmas halftime. It's like when I was a kid, Thanksgiving was Thanksgiving and Santa wasn't poking his ass into it. But Santa's poking his ass everywhere now, man, because that means more money spent, more profit. And I don't want to be cynical about things, but sometimes it gets to you, man. And so I read to you from Siegfried Sassoon, one of the First World War poets, one of the great English poets of the First World War. Sassoon's an interesting story, all right? He was born into a certain amount of privilege, not uber wealthy, not like Downton Abbey wealth, but was born into a sort of family where, you know, fox hunting, that kind of thing. Thus the title of one of his memoirs, Memoir of a Fox Hunting Man. Fabulous read, by the way. And went off to college and then had this sort of genteel, somewhat sheltered, I guess, experience of and view of the world. Was a poet writing this romantic poetry, right? This very innocent poetry, this kind of idyllic poetry as a kid. Then he goes off to the trenches of the First World War, and any romanticism and idealism you might have gone in with is very, very quickly snuffed out under those circumstances. And I think Sassoon went into the war, I think, caught up in the kind of fervor that a lot of soldiers were, particularly in the beginning. It was a mad rush. It was a mad rush in 1914 to enlist, to sign up, to get over there before it was too late, to get in on the action, to get in on the grand adventure of it all. Off to war we go. It's going to be a great lark. They say it's going to be over by Christmas. Don't want to miss it, man. Don't want to miss it. Turns out the first 3 or so months of the First World War were per capita the bloodiest of the entire conflict. Open warfare. People marching out into battle in 19th century battle formations, walking into modern artillery and machine gun fire, and were mowed down in their thousands. And an interesting thing happens, because Sassoon, the poet, begins to experience these things, begins to have, you know, the shackles, begins to have the scales knocked from his eyes about the reality of the world and the reality of warfare. And this grand adventure turns out to be a nightmare indeed. And the timbre, the texture of his poems, begins rapidly to change from this kind of romanticized, idealist, cloistered English countryside poetry into the gritty, harsh, real-world poetry of the war. And he does not shy away from describing those realities to himself, to whoever will read his work. And some people say that the poetry of Sassoon and of Robert Graves and of Wilfred Owen and some of these other cats that became very graphic, very real throughout the course of this conflict helped to usher in the modern age that we've talked about in terms of writing, in terms of painting, this gritty, real description of what's happening, you know, not this elevated death and glory stuff, but the real reality of it. Here is the subject of this poem that I read to you, called A Working Party. And he's just a guy from a town back in England. He's got a lady, laughs at people's jokes, a good chap, you know. And he's out doing his thing, working party. Everything happened at night. First World War, everything happened at night. Why? Because it's dark. So you've got to repair your line, you've got to repair your trench, and the working parties go out. You know, they string the barbed wire, and they fix whatever got blown up in the trench wall that day. And it's sandbags, and it's dangerous work, man. And flares are going up all the time. These big white flares. And they illuminate the entire battlefield, right? And you'll find, if you're looking, a team of people laying telephone cable or laying barbed wire, and they're sitting ducks. And the game is, if the flare goes up, you freeze. You stand utterly still, and for the 30 seconds, wherever it is, the flare is up in the air, you pray to whatever god you pray to that nobody on the other side sees you out there, because you're dead if they do. This is serious business, man, and here's this guy, just another soldier in the line, doing his sandbag thing, and a flare goes up, and as he dropped his head, the instant split his startled life with lead. Somebody saw him, somebody shot him. And that's it. That's his war. That's his life. And he's just another casualty. He's just another statistic in the hundreds of thousands of statistics in this war. And Sassoon goes through this experience, and he himself won the Military Cross for bravery, was recommended for the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military honor that the British Army can give you. He himself, romantic poet, was a maniac. They called him Mad Jack because he was always dashing off on these insane feats of bravery. His good friend, the fellow celebrated war poet Robert Graves, said that Sassoon was capable of, quote, suicidal feats of bravery. And he would just go nuts because of the pressure, because of the anger, because of the sadness, because of the sheer horror of the experience of World War I. Would just drive him mad. And so he would just go dashing off into the enemy line or take out a trench or a machine gun nest, leaving himself completely exposed. He would just run in. He would see red, he would run in. This mild-mannered, gentle, romantic poet was so affected by the line, by the experience of the war, that he would just go off. And he would do crazy stuff. They called him Mad Jack. Eventually he got wounded, and he was convalescing somewhere, or like 1917, I want to say, and he penned a letter. He decided he'd had enough, all right? He penned a letter that eventually was published in newspapers called Finished with the War, A Soldier's Declaration. And this is one of the celebrated poets of the war. His poetry is being published. He's a name people recognize. He's Siegfried Sassoon. And he is publicly admonishing the leadership of the war, saying he is done because of the conduct of the war. All right, in his view, this started off as a war of defense, right? This started off as a war against German aggression. We're protecting our homeland. We're protecting our ideals in the West, whatever. High-minded notions. And then as the war has gone on, he's like, we could stop this. There's no reason for this to continue, and yet it continues. And it occurs to him that this is becoming a capitalist war. That the people in charge, even in England, in the Allied powers, are turning this also into a war of aggression and territory and colonialism. All the same old stuff. All the same old stuff that wars are always being fought for. But the sacrifice this time is beyond outrageous. Hundreds of thousands. 1 million British soldiers died in this conflict-ish. All right? We're talking about destruction on a level that's never even been conceived before. And the horror is beyond description. Try, as a poet, as he might to describe it. The people back home who are saying, go out and give those Jerrys a real show, lads. They don't get it. A lot of soldiers would go back to England to recover from wounds, or they would have leave and they would go back to England, and people there would have no concept. It'd be all this rah, 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 give the Huns one, you know what I mean? With no concept of what life is actually like in the trenches, what the experience of the war is actually like. And a lot of the soldiers became disillusioned with this idea, didn't want to go back to England anymore. Now, I've got leave. I'm not going to England. I just don't want to see the people there. I don't want to hear this rah, rah, death and glory stuff that is so far removed from the actual experience, the day-to-day experience, where your whole life is the 10 yards in front of you and the man beside you. And can we survive another freaking day? And by the way, all around me is death and filth and rats and lice and latrines and cemeteries they built 6 months ago that just got hit by shell fire and blew all those corpses all over. Like, it was a nightmare that I'm trying to describe, and how on earth could I? But people didn't want to go home because they don't want to deal with this, you know? And I don't want to pretend it's okay. So people like Sassoon would go mad, and so he's in the hospital, and he's like, the people who are in charge of this could end this if they chose to. They're not choosing to. And so I'm putting my foot down, and it was a huge scandal. I mean, this was the white feather days. You know, if you were a young man of age, perceived to be of fighting age, and you were not in uniform and not at the front, people would pin a white feather on you. Coward. Coward. Imagine the enormous pressure. And I mean, there would be kids who were 14 or 15 and looked older, but weren't, and they'd get beat up or knocked down and have a feather stuck on them. Coward. Pacifist. Not doing your bit, you know? All this kind of propaganda. Or you would be a person who had been in the line and been wounded and been discharged. And you're walking around in plain clothes, you get the feather. I was like, dude, I was there for 6 freaking months. You're feathering me. You know, there was a lot of this pressure, and people just didn't want to be around it. Didn't want to go back there to this chaos, because the reality is, for the frontline soldier, there wasn't a war. You know, there wasn't a wider war. There wasn't a global conflict. There was 10 yards. There was the 10 yards that you could see in front of you and the guy beside you. And that was your war. And that was your life. And that was your meaning. And it was, can we survive another freaking day? And Sassoon wrote this letter that was a huge scandal. And they had to cover it up. You know, they came out with a story that he was suffering from neurasthenia, better known to you and me as shell shock, known now as PTSD. And they shot you for that too, by the way. You're faking this. You're a coward. We have to shoot you to send a message to the other soldiers that if you won't fight, because you've literally gone insane, we're going to shoot you, because we know that that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as PTSD. It's just pure cowardice, man. So Sassoon was famous. I mean, this guy has the military cross. He's not a coward. He's a nutcase on the battlefield, you know? And huge scandal. And then he went on after the war to publish his memoirs, his novels, his poems. One of the most celebrated writers of the conflict, Siegfried Sassoon. And that's his poem, A Working Party. And I share it now just to maybe suggest we ought to pause the Christmas music in order to observe Remembrance Day, which is this coming weekend, which is why I share it now. For me, Remembrance Week, the Remembrance time period, starts on Halloween with Charlie Brown. As you know, my lifelong fascination with the First World War kind of began there, with this bizarre cutaway scenes from It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, where Snoopy, the First World War flying ace, is shot down over France by the Red Baron, Baron von Richthofen, who I've talked about on this show before. And he's crawling through the countryside of France trying to get back to his own lines. And I remember as a kid watching this and being utterly moved by it. And it's something to do with the way the sky was drawn in those sequences. I mean, this is the 60s. The animation is crude, but there's something really evocative about the sky in those scenes. Really evocative. And there's something about Halloween more generally, all right? There is a vibe on Halloween that I really love. Halloween is my favorite holiday. New Year's Day is my favorite day. But Halloween, there's something so evocative about Halloween that I just love it. And I think that came through in these bizarre scenes with Snoopy the World War I flying ace. And so I saw that as a kid, and I was fascinated by just the atmosphere, just the sky, just the darkness, just the whole vibe of how they wrote that. It's very, very strange for a kid's cartoon to get wrapped up in the trenches of the First World War. Very, very strange, but obviously very effective for me. And around the same time, I saw the 1979 television version of All Quiet on the Western Front, starring John Boy Walton. And the combination of those two things really did it for me. Something about that war, something about that film, which I was like 6 years old watching that and probably shouldn't have been. But something about it just captured it for me. And I did watch the new All Quiet on the Western Front, came out last year. And I was, to be honest, a little bit disappointed by it. Frankly, I think visually it's amazing. And for somebody like me who's a First World War guy, what you want in a First World War movie is to see it. You want to see no man's land. You want to see the trenches. You want to see the war because you read about it and you can imagine it. And a lot of movies from back in the day are somewhat sanitized about that. They either didn't have the effects or the culture was such that you couldn't be all that graphic about it. That's changed now. You get things like Private Ryan, which of course was Second World War, but as graphic and as real as it gets. I mean, I heard stories about veterans of World War II, veterans of D-Day, who couldn't hack the first 20 minutes of that film. It was too real. It brought back too many memories. They couldn't deal. They walked out. And okay, great. So that's not great, but I understand that we have reached a point now where the technology and the climate is such that we can be really real about this stuff. And so, I liked the 1917 movie. It's not exactly what I want. Some of the scenes in Passchendaele, some of them say were not historically accurate per se, but it gave you a glimpse at least. It gave you a glimpse of the experience. And that's what a lot of us want. And there's just something about that war that still affects me so freaking much. And so I watched the new All Quiet on the Western Front. I might give it another go. I didn't like it because it bore almost no resemblance to the actual story of All Quiet on the Western Front, which annoyed me. And the ending of that film, the original film from the 30s, the 1979 TV version, the book itself, All Quiet on the Western Front, ends in a really profound way. Can I give it away now? I suppose I can. If you are interested in the story, you've already watched it. But the whole point of All Quiet on the Western Front is that would be a daily dispatch to HQ. All right, such and such a date, 1918, 1917, All Quiet on the Western Front, meaning nothing of great significance has happened on the Western Front today that we need to be aware of. But then you get this character, Paulie, the main character, German soldier, First World War, an artist, a gentle spirit. And what's happened at the end of that film is that he's in a trench. He's gone through this whole experience of signing up in the early days of the war, and he's survived, and his friends are dead. He's seen all the stuff that drove Siegfried Sassoon mad enough to pen this letter of opposition. And then one day, he's just in the trench sketching, and he sees a bird. And he wants to sketch the bird. And so he peeks up just a little bit higher, sits a little bit taller to get a better look at the bird, just enough for his helmet to sneak an inch or two above the top of the trench, and there's a sniper. Sniper gets him. And isn't that reminiscent of Sassoon's poem? And as he dropped his head, the instant split his startled life with lead, and all went out. And that is the end of Paul's life. All right, he's killed in that instant, and yet the dispatch says All Quiet on the Western Front. And that is the commentary that life became so disposable. For his family, it's the worst thing that could ever possibly happen. And yet in the eyes of HQ and German command, All Quiet on the Western Front, they lost hundreds of men daily to what they called wastage. That was the official term for folks just killed in the line in day-to-day life. Snipers, shelling, whatever. Wastage today was 1,000 men or 200 men. What's the number that it has to get to before it's not all quiet on the Western Front anymore? And this is the way individual soldiers were considered and treated. Just wastage. Cannon fodder. And so here we have this beautiful soul, Paul, doesn't actually want to hurt anybody, but he's been cynicized and he's been destroyed by the experience of this war, and yet he still sees a certain beauty. Sees a bird that he wants to sketch. And in the process of doing that, of acknowledging, of recognizing that this beauty can still exist in this nightmare, he's shot by a sniper for it, and his life is over, and that's all quiet on the Western Front. But the new film doesn't do that. The new film is not subtle, and it annoys me because we're not that stupid. The ending of the new film, it's November 11th, 1918. The fighting continued right up until 11 o'clock, all right? They continued fighting until the moment of armistice, and people died that day. People died or were wounded that day and died the next day. People didn't need to die on November 11th, and they did. And so the end of the new film, sorry for any spoilers, has the Germans and Paul attacking on the 11th of November, attacking a trench. And then at like 5 seconds to 11 o'clock, 5 seconds to the armistice, they all knew was happening at this point in time. He gets stabbed and the war ends. And then the fighting in the trenches, literally, they just stop and start kind of looking at each other. It's like the end of a soccer match. They start, shaking hands, go back to their really, really weird. But here we have our hero, Paul, who literally at the last second is stabbed and will die. And it's like, we don't need to dumb it down that way, folks. We don't need to be, why not just put up a big written panel on the screen that says, people died needlessly in this war. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to be that blatant about it. The original ending was poetic. It was artistic. It made you think, it left you just thinking about the whole thing. Where this new ending, it seems so typical of modern times. We just dumb it down. We'll just explain exactly how you're supposed to feel and think about this. And it annoyed me because it didn't need to be that way. They didn't need to change what was a poetic and beautiful ending to a film that made the point and allowed you to think about the point and understand it on your own terms. And it just irked me that they chose to end it so blatantly and to pound you with the message so obviously. It annoyed me that they thought so little of the audience, that they thought we were stupid enough to not get the real ending of the film, which is so profound and which informs the title of the whole dang thing, All Quiet on the Western Front. But is it? I mean, you can't report on the ending of that scene in the new movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. There was a huge freaking attack, and it's the last day of the war. This is not all quiet. For me, it utterly destroyed the whole premise, the whole message, the whole subtlety of the freaking film. And I was disappointed in that. But visually, really something to look at. If you can approach it, if you are a fan of All Quiet on the Western Front, if you can look at this as not being that film, if you could call it, like, why do they even call it that? It's nothing. It's not the same. It's not the same. Not just the ending. It's not the same freaking story. So call it something else, okay? And then you've got yourself an interesting First World War film. Interesting to look at. And just irked me. As it irks me that the Christmas music is happening already. And it irks a lot of people every year that we got this pounded into our ears. And we now know that, maybe you knew already, that this is purely about getting you to stay in the store and spend your money. And it's hard not to be cynical, kids. It's hard not to be cynical. And I did not intend to do a 30-minute diatribe about this. I intended to do 5 minutes as an intro with the Siegfried Sassoon poem. But, sometimes the spirit just takes control. What I really wanted to talk about today was some new music. I haven't done that in a while. And unless you've been living under a rock You know that the new and final Beatles song was recently released. It is Now and Then. And what year is it? The Stones have a new album out and the Beatles have a new single. It's 1967 all over again, kids. Weird, right? But the new Beatles song came out, and I would be remiss if I did not talk about it. I like it. It's called Now and Then, and it's really interesting because this is a tune. They were working from a demo that John Lennon did in the late 70s. And in the 90s, they tried to, the surviving Beatles, Paul and George and Ringo, tried to pick, I always say Ringo as though he's Australian. They tried to pick this up and make a song out of it, but the vocal track on Lennon's demo, it was recorded in the 70s, probably like to a cassette, who knows, not good enough to make a viable vocal track for the song. And they tried with the tech they had in the 90s to make this thing work, but vocally they just could not get it to the level they needed it to. But they had Ringo recording drums in the 90s. They had George Harrison playing guitar. They had Paul adding backup vocals, playing bass. I mean, they tracked a lot of this stuff in the 90s, and that was good enough to use. The vocal track, they just never could make it work. And so they sat on it for many, 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 many years, and then George Harrison died and the whole thing. But when they made the Get Back documentary, really fabulous to watch, Peter Jackson and his team came up with technology that they could use to pull out and enhance vocal tracks from the film recordings that they made during all those the sessions that became the Get Back documentary. And so they applied the same technology to John Lennon's demo for Now and Then. And suddenly, with that AI, they created a vocal track that could work. And when I first heard about this, I had the same sort of thought that I think a lot of people did, which was, uh-oh, are they just doing an AI John Lennon? Because they can do that now. We know they can do that now, and I don't know what it means for the future of music. It worries me just a little bit. So I thought they are, from the ground up, recreating an AI version of John Lennon's voice, and that's what this song is going to be, and I was prepared to have some dissonance about that, but it's not the case. All right, they have used an AI, and they've used new technology to enhance an existing demo vocal track that John Lennon actually sang. So what you get on this is John Lennon's vocal track, the stuff they recorded in the 90s, and then some enhancements that they've done with the current recording of it. And so I don't know the complete timeline on this, but it's all four Beatles. It is the last song that will have all four of the Beatles on it. And they've added some strings to it, added some instrumentation to it. And you watch the video for it, and it's such a nostalgia trip. It's really, really interesting because you watch the video for the new Rolling Stones tune, and it's just a hot chick in a car, in the back of a car, looking hot, going through LA, being hot. And everywhere she looks at the billboards, though, there's old footage of the Rolling Stones. And so there's a certain amount of nostalgia attached to that. This Beatles song is pure nostalgia. And in a way, it's sad, it's a bit melancholy. It's moving because they will have footage from the 90s of George Harrison, Ringo recording this stuff, and then they will cut that with modern footage of Sir Paul and of Ringo doing their thing, looking as they do now. But there are moments where it's like the four Beatles are playing together, but it's old Paul and it's old Ringo and it's young John and it's young George. And they splice these things together. And then there's footage of the Beatles back in the day, the really early Beatles, the like rockabilly 1950s Beatles looking, and then the 60s Beatles, the Shea Stadium. And they intersperse and splice all of this footage together. And you get this picture, you get this story of what is probably, you have to argue, the most important rock and roll band of all time. I mean, the Beatles are iconic in a way that nobody else freaking is. And then you look back with nostalgia and a bit of melancholy on the way things were and the way things are. And the song itself is sad. The song itself is, well, the verses are sad. The chorus has a bit of an uplift to it, but you get a sense from it of the real end of an era, not just necessarily the Beatles, but the 60s. The 60s, the 70s, and how things used to be. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there right now who lived that era, who are in their 70s now, who are in their 80s now, who may be looking back with a certain melancholy on life gone by. And it's hard not to be moved by it. You know, when you get wrapped up in the story, it's hard not to be moved by Now and Then by the Beatles. And I really like it. I don't know that it will go down as a classic Beatles song. It's very, very difficult to displace some of the songs on that list, which is a long list, by the way. But for me, it's just fun. In a way, fun and novel to really get just another look at the most iconic band of all freaking time. And I like this song. Probably not going to go back and listen to it a lot, but it just shows you again, this is to a certain extent a throwaway Beatles song. And you look at it and you're like, this is like a B-side song, and it's that good. That's how good the Beatles were, the Beatles are. And they aren't going to be around forever. You know, Ringo Starr looks like he's 42, but he's 80. And Sir Paul is not a young man anymore. And the Beatles are going to go. And I really appreciate it, and I think it's cool that they could use the tech this way to do it. But I shudder just a little bit at the prospect of a day when all the Beatles are gone and whoever owns their catalog can make AI versions of them that are convincing and can probably, like, I don't know where this goes. I have a sense of older acts using AI to recreate voices for their new recordings. Like, I wondered about that with the new Stone stuff because Mick sounds really good on it. Mick sounds like Mick, but then I saw live footage that was pretty convincing to me that he actually still has Mick Jagger's voice. But it's not hard to imagine the Stones or some other legacy band like that going into the studio where the singer ain't got it anymore because the singer's old and they just fake it. You can do a lot in the studio now to fake it. But they just create an AI that's the singer's voice, and they make new records. And then live, you use tracks or whatever. Like, I see the day coming when so much is just artificial. And we're reaching that point now where almost everything you see, you're like, is it real? Is it not real? I saw an ad for a new phone, and one of the selling points is how much you can manipulate the photos with this phone. So it's like a dude and he's in some city somewhere, some tourist site, and he like jumps in the air and snaps the photo. But then the tech on this phone, you can kind of capture his body in the image and move it wherever you want. So all of a sudden he's jumping 10 feet in the air, not 2, you know what I mean? And you sit back and you're like, is anything real? Can you trust any dang thing you see or hear anymore? And I don't even know. It's not hard to lose your mind. Like, what is real and what isn't? What can I believe and what can I not believe is real? With movies, you suspend disbelief going in, but now this is filtering into reality. And you see this on Instagram. You see this on TikTok. People using the filters now. And you're like, she doesn't look like that. He doesn't look like that. And I don't know. Like, I'm old enough that I can be somewhat discerning about this, but for young people, how much pressure is there to use filters? And all these things are meant to enhance your appearance. So immediately it's like, however you are is not good enough. You've got to use these filters to make yourself better. Make yourself better, you know? And I don't know what it's going to mean for music. You imagine the day when there are no bands anymore. You know, labels who are already stingy with artists. It's like, you know what? We're just going to create AI bands now. And we'll release those. And it's free for us, basically, once we have purchased the tech. Or we pay the people who manipulate the tech. And we don't have artists anymore. And it's funny because now it's funny because people are talking about Milli Vanilli now. And you're just going to have Milli Vanillis everywhere, you know, artists that didn't sing any of it. And it's a complete AI manipulation. And does it matter? I don't know. Does it matter what reality is? I don't know. I don't want to go off on that train. I ain't no philosopher. But I do like Now and Then by the Beatles. And I think it's a really touching song. I think it's a really touching video if you go and look at it. And I discovered the Beatles late in life. And it's just, for me, again, I get nostalgic for eras I did not experience. The Beatles is one of those eras. I do remember where I was when I heard that John Lennon was shot. It was 1980. I was driving in the car with my family, and I feel like we were in Toronto. And it came over the radio, and I had no idea what any of it meant. I just understood that a moment of great significance had happened because my parents were affected by it. John Lennon killed by a fan, and it didn't mean anything to me at the time, but I picked up on it meaning things to other people, you know. And then I didn't really get into the Beatles music until much, much later when I started covering a lot of those songs in bands and stuff. And then that took me down the rabbit hole. And I love the Beatles now. I love the Beatles. I love their influence on King's X. I love their influence on me. I am part of the Ringo Starr drumming lineage, man. That is my school. Simplicity, playing for the song, interesting fills. Ringo is my freaking guy, man. And I like Now and Then. Now, there's another song that came out that does not quite inspire the same nostalgia as a new Beatles song does, but it is Loyal to the Lie, of course, by Mick Mars, the first solo tune from Mick after Mick, quote-unquote, retired from Motley Crue, and nobody quite knows the circumstances of that, but it's been rather acrimonious. Mick Mars has always been my favorite part of Motley Crue. I've never been the hugest Motley fan. I like Motley Crue, and I appreciate Motley Crue, and I get how important Motley Crue is to the emergence of the Sunset Strip scene, the glam metal scene that followed in the 80s, which was my era. You know, a lot of the bands that I was into came along as a product of Motley Crue coming along, and they were a moment in time. You know, MTV was launched. Music suddenly needed to become really, really visual. And what was more visual in 1983 than freaking Motley Crue, man? This satanic looking, weird pink spandex, football makeup, the hair, the whole freaking thing. But I always loved Mick Mars. I love the freaking top hats. Give me a guy in a good hat. Like the top hat. Always liked his tone. Always liked his playing. I think Mick Mars is an extremely underrated rock guitarist. Love his tone. Love his soloing. I just think Mick Mars has a vibe that is all Mick Mars. And Motley Crue without him is not the same. Now, I have not seen anything with the John 5, and I don't really care all that much. I think Vince Neil is a crisis vocally. But I always loved Mick, and it's awful what he's dealing with physically. Like, his health is a problem. I can get why he couldn't tour anymore. Touring is so demanding on your freaking body. And when you've got the sort of disease that he has, and you're in your 70s anyhow, rough proposition, man. But I always loved Mick's playing. I always loved his tone. I liked his look. I liked his freaking hats. I think Mick Mars just has a cool vibe about him. And it sucks to me that he's been kind of railroaded by Motley Crue, man. I mean, so much of their success is owed to Mick Mars and his writing and his guitar playing, man. And I just think it's unfair that he is not treated with the kind of respect I feel like he deserves. But Mick is like, you know what? Shine these guys. I'm going solo. I'm going to release some freaking music that a lot of people will say is better than anything Motley Crue released, you know, in the past, whenever they've released stuff. I'm not the judge of that. But here we have this song, Loyal to the Lie, from the forthcoming album, The Other Side of Mars. And I dig it. It's freaking heavy. It's got a very modern kind of sound, I think. Really heavy. Like it's a detuned, heavy riff. Good vocals by this cat, Jacob Bunton. And Ray Luzier from Korn plays drums on it. And you cannot go wrong with Ray Luzier. And you'll know Ray, of course, as part of the KXM side project with Doug Pinnick and George Lynch. Released a couple of really cool records. Ray is the drummer in that project. Killer player. I mean, some guys, some girls, some drummers are just freaking beyond in their technical ability. Ray Luzier is one of them. Crushes it on this track, and I like it. I like the verses. Don't love the chorus. Got to be perfectly honest. Justin Hawkins did a review of it. Justin Hawkins Rides Again. where his reaction was kind of a shoulder shrug, kind of meh. I mean, it does not have a long guitar solo. That was Justin's complaint. It's like, if you're going to be Mick Mars and you're going to be fundamentally excommunicated from Motley Crue, but you are the guitar player from that band and you are going solo and you want to stick it in their freaking faces, rock a blistering guitar solo on your first single, right? Which he does not do. There is a solo. It's very short and it's Mick Mars and it's cool. But on the whole, I dig the song. I'm just never going to listen to it again, I don't think. You know, I'm interested in the record, though. I'm interested in Mick Mars really showing what he brought to the band, you know. So I'm going to listen to the record. I think when it comes out early next year. This song is cool. I dig it. I like the riff. It's heavy, rocks. Great seeing 70-plus-year-olds bring out tunes that freaking rock. Just don't love the chorus. But I think it's promising. I think it shows some promise for whatever Mick is doing while he can still do it. You know, he said himself he's probably only going to live 7 or 8 more years. Wants to cram in as much as he can, and I respect that. He said he wanted to release something that was just big and mean. And this tune is big and mean. I dig it. It rocks. So good on you, Mick. Looking forward to hearing the rest of the record. Pretty freaking cool, like the Top Hats. There was other stuff I was going to talk about today. I'm rapidly running out of time, but before I go, I want to give a quick shout out. I want to give a shout out to the Sunday Night Army podcast. That's my old pal Jacob, and that's an interesting show, all right? That's a very music-focused show. Does a lot of interviews with indie artists, and so I'm putting in a plug right now. All of you indie artists, particularly those in southwestern Ontario, you are interested in having your music covered, having your name spread around. One of the great ways to do that is podcasts, particularly indie podcasts. You know, when I was doing publicity, I was beginning to get into having my artists featured on podcasts because music podcasts are always looking for good content to cover. And for indie artists, this is just a great way to expose yourself and your music. Be careful about exposing yourself, particularly on YouTube podcasts, to wider audiences. So if you're an indie artist and you are not hitting up music podcasts to be featured, interviewed, etc., start doing it, man, because you can get a lot of new listeners that way, you know? Very important. Sunday Night Army, Jacob is one of them. Features a lot of indie music, particularly Southwestern Ontario music. Really good guy, really good podcast. And what he's doing as a special kind of project is he's doing these episodes where he's having other podcasters chime in on questions that he asks. And I was part of this. I am featured's the wrong word. I am included on his episode. I guess technically it's this week. His most recent episode, as you're listening to this, of the Sunday Night Army, where he asked several podcasters 2 questions. A, tell us about a musical act or artist or band that you discovered later in life and became a favorite of yours. And the second question is, name an artist or band that is, in your opinion, overrated. And so I answered those 2 questions on the most recent episode of the Sunday Night Army podcast. And if you're curious about what I had to say in answer to those questions, you can go check that out. It is available wherever you enjoy fine podcasts. Want to thank Jacob for that. Want to send all of you who are interested in new music over to the Sunday Night Army to listen to that show, man. You'll discover some new stuff there. Always like to plug and promote other podcasts on my show. You know, the indie podcasting scene is much like the indie music scene, where for the most part we work together and we support each other and we help each other out because we are all in this together, kids. And so I'm always happy to do that. I want to thank Jacob for having me on that episode. It was fun to do. Some other really interesting podcasts featured there as well. So go check that out, the Sunday Night Army podcast. There is a Patreon page, by the way, for this podcast. I will not give you the full Patreon plug. Patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. Simply if you are getting something from these episodes, if you are being educated, inspired, entertained, just like having a friendly voice in your ears once a week, please consider supporting on Patreon. Patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. I have one tier of membership. It is $5 a month. And that is you saying, I like what you're doing, Jack. Warms my cockles. I want to support you. Think of it as giving me a $1.25 tip for every episode that I do. John Huff Podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com/John Huff Podcast. And thanks so much for the people who have done that. Merch. It's merch season. I should be running a Christmas song behind this. john-huff.com/shop, t-shirts, mugs, etc. I got some really fun stuff there. Some cool t-shirts, man, that you can give to the podcast lover in your life. That's all the plugging I'm going to do right now. I got to go. This thing is longer than I intended. And I got a rehearsal coming up because Fresh Breath is releasing their new CD through my window Saturday night in Kingsville. I know that's Remembrance Day. And sometimes you play on Remembrance Day, man. That's just the way it goes. It's a Saturday night. Really proud of this record. It is available now. It is streaming. I played on it. Ken the Zen, Josh Cady, Brett the producer who played guitar as well. Just a really good Americana record, man. And I'm really honored and proud to be part of that band and to have played on that record. And we're rehearsing today, the last rehearsal before we play the big shoe. So if you're in the Kingsville area, Saturday, November 11th, come check out that show. We're going to play the whole record front to back and some other Fresh Breath classics. Gonna have a good time. I want to thank you for hanging out this far, and I hope you're doing freaking well. Go listen to the Beatles, listen to Mick, read some Siegfried Sassoon, pay your respects on Remembrance Day. Listen to the Sunday Night Army. Good things happen when you put yourself out there. And hey, kids, I'll check you later. Yeah. I know it's true. It's all because of you. I don't know the song well enough to sing the rest, but it's a good one. Go check it out.